Welcome everyone to today's session with Eric Walters. Eric is an educator from the US. He works in high schools and is a specialist in science and languages. Today, he'll be sharing with us content curation as a context for teaching and learning in science. I'd like to thank all of our sponsors and our supporters today. Thank you very much to Steve Hargaden and the Learning Revolution and the Australia E-Series who are putting on this great conference. Also thank you to Cyber Academy for their sponsorship and support of the conference, and also to Coach Carol and Shambles Guru who are wonderful supporters of this initiative. So thank you very much to those people. As we're getting started today, if you'd like to just grab a little picture by clicking on the arrow button on the left-hand side and just put where you are today in the world. So I'm putting mine over on the very east coast of Australia. Okay, and I've got you on our slides. We've got some Victorians, and we've also got someone from America, and we've got Eric over in New York City in America. Great to see. Excellent. Okay, so I'll hand over to Eric. I'm really looking forward to this presentation because content curation is one of my favourite tools for learning, and I'd like to see how I can use that with my class. So over to you. Thanks, Eric.
Thank you so much, Nez, and thank you so much for having me participate in this what I consider to be a really innovative and interesting conference. My co-presenter, Katie Krieger, is at home with a newborn baby, so she will not be joining us today. So I'm going to do my best to speak about her project on using the cicadas. So Katie and I are both high school teachers at the Marymount School of New York. I teach AP Physics, Physics and Atmospheric Science, and Katie teaches molecular biology and biology. And we've been having a lot of conversations within our science department and within the school about really re-examining what our curriculum is, what are our content streams, and how are we having students represent their knowledge and understanding. So that's going to be the focus of what we're going to be talking about today. If you do have any questions, you can certainly type them in the chat window, and I'll do my best to respond to them as we go along, so don't hesitate to ask questions. So here we go. So one of the challenges that we've had at our school in the last 2 years is that we've moved from a model where classes met for 45 minutes pretty much every day, now to a model where our classes meet 75 minutes every other day. So as you might imagine, as a science teacher, this was exciting news for us because no longer were we held down by the fact that we only had a lab period of 90 minutes every other week. So this allowed us really to broaden what we were doing in our classes and to really address multiple modalities within a class period. So that challenged us to really start to think about where our content was coming from and how we were going to use that content in varied ways within a class period or within, we're on an 8-day cycle, so within those 8 days, how are we going to build our content differently and how are we going to build our classes differently? One of the other challenges that we have, and I think a lot of teachers have this, is that our students expect us, rightly or wrongly, to be available to them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, Katie and I would advocate that we shouldn't be really teaching and learning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But there are opportunities for our students as citizen scientists to be collecting data, analyzing data, not just in the confines of the school or in the confines of the science lab, but outside the science lab. And that's one of the things we're going to be talking about here today. So we have to reimagine our 75 minutes. We have to reimagine our 24 hours a day, 7 days a week of learning. And how do we then bring our students along to meet those expectations? So one of the things that we've also discussed is moving from a model of what we call prescribed knowledge, where the teacher is the sage on the stage, imparting knowledge and information to the students, and the students are receiving that knowledge, to a model where the students are constructing their own knowledge. And one of the challenges of doing this is that it requires the teacher to give up control of the curriculum of the class. And there are some teachers that are more than willing to do this, and there are some teachers that have a very difficult time doing this. And by giving up control, I don't mean letting the students loose to do whatever they want, but giving them sort of a construct and a context for what they're learning, and letting them be the students, letting them be the people that are really building their own understanding in ways that are meaningful to them. So when we're looking at our own curriculum, and in the course of this presentation, we're going to talk about 3 examples of curriculum ideas that we've implemented over the last 2 years. A couple of things that sort of resonate with both Katie and I about the work that we're doing in our science classes. First, we want the learning for our students to be authentic, and we want it to be relevant. And I think that's true not just in science classes, that's true in every class. If the students don't have the connection with what they're learning, then they're not going to move forward in their learning. We also want the learning in some ways to be disruptive. If you walk through any of the science classes at our school, without understanding the context in which these classes are taught, it may come across as being pure bedlam. But we're using things like modeling, we're using independent learning, we're using student-constructed knowledge. So there's a lot of noise going on in the room, but that noise is really reflective of the enthusiasm and the learning that's taking place in the classroom. The last 3 are really goals that we also have as well. We want to empower our students. One of the topics that I'll be talking about in my next session is looking at social justice issues in the science class. We want our students to collaborate not just within the classroom, but we want them to collaborate beyond the classroom. And we also want our students to be connected, and that goes, hand in hand with collaboration. What kind of things can our students be doing that are connecting them to students in other schools? One of my favorite books, and I call this book my Bible, Katie does as well, it's by a man named Alan November. And if you haven't heard his Tech Talk, if you haven't seen any of his videos, he is really fantastic. He got to start in the state of Massachusetts in the United States by having the students create a health clinic for his local neighborhood, and he's transformed that really into an understanding about who owns the learning. So for an 80-page book, it's filled with a lot of information. We really view our students as tutorial designers. We want them to be writing, we want them to be researching, and most importantly, we want them to be global communicators and global collaborators. So students can do projects and do all sorts of work within the classroom, but if they're not communicating that work beyond the classroom, then in some ways it's an unsuccessful approach to learning. That's one of the things we've been really working on, is that how are you communicating what you're doing? That does require a reimagining, again, of your curriculum, so that you're giving students the opportunity to blog or to create videos or to share their work with their peers. It also sets up a really nice opportunity for the students to do peer review. So my big focus in the last year has been really getting my students to be global communicators and collaborators. So if we're reimagining our curriculum, we're also going to have to rethink our content streams. And we've done this before, and I think we've always done this as teachers. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of these content streams in a moment. So the way we sort of look at it is that we're getting content from disparate sources. When I was in junior high school and high school in the 1970s, my teachers did the same thing. Back then in the United States, it was things like film strips and movies, workbooks, handouts, things like that. So teachers would be pulling content from all over the place, not just necessarily a textbook. Now what we're starting to see is that those sources for our content are coming from different places. And not only, as we'll talk about in a minute, not only are the teachers able to come up with these disparate sources, students can be the ones that are content curators as well. So the content curators could be your student, could be me as the teacher, it could be us working together. Both Katie and I have noticed that since we've sort of moved to this model of students constructing their own knowledge, that our students have become much more confident in sharing content that they've discovered themselves. So it may be a student saying, I found a really interesting video on YouTube, or a really interesting course on iTunes U, or I found a really interesting app on my phone, and there's a way that we can use this in class. Previously, a lot of the times, the challenge was on the teacher to think about how we could use these different content streams in class. Now what we've noticed is that Katie and I are challenging our students back and asking them, how would you work this into your own learning, the video, the iTunes U course, or the app, so that we're going back to that concept of empowering the students to become active participants in their education. So some of the content streams that I mentioned before, apps are really quite popular. All of our students have their own laptops, but then Katie and I teach in a very special situation with our senior electives that all of our students in molecular biology and in AP Physics have their own iPads as well. One of the other benefits is that our students are allowed to have their own phones in class, and we do a little survey at the beginning of the year. Most of our students have iPhones. A couple of them have Android phones, which is okay. But we also learn to leverage those devices in our classes as well. So I don't have to give the students in, for example, my honors physics class, which is an 11th grade class, I can say to them, I need you to put this app on your phone. We're going to be using this for learning during the course of this week. The nice thing about that is the cost of apps is they're either free or they're very low cost. So asking students to spend $2.99 on an app is usually not that much of a struggle. If there are economic issues, then the school provides the students with a iTunes gift card to pay for those apps. Certainly web content is really quite important. YouTube content, if you dig deep, you can find a lot of valuable content on YouTube. In the upper left-hand corner, that's the icon for the iBookstore. Both Katie and I have written our own textbooks and parts of textbooks. We've also had our students write parts of books and write their own books, so that goes back to the idea of having students being scribes and collaborators. And the center icon is iTunes U, which is a wealth of material for students to access. A lot of really great college courses and a lot of great podcasts and tutorials that the students can access on their own phones. Now, of course, if they have an Android phone, that's a challenge. But like I said, we're lucky that most of our students have iPhones or iPads. So we're going to talk about some of the projects that Katie and I have done in the last couple of years. And the nice thing about these projects is that they're always evolving. And I can tell you the first project we're going to talk about, the Urban Air Pollution Project, has evolved even in the last week. I've rethought how to extend this project even further. So this project is actually student designed, and my students in my senior elective atmospheric science designed this project last year, and part of their legacy was that they left it to this year's class, and since it's such a great project, I decided to let them do it again this year. Like I said, it has evolved nicely in the last week or so. So the essential question is, how does urban air pollution vary with location? Our school is in Manhattan. We're on the corner of 84th Street and 5th Avenue. We're also, at that corner, there's a lot of bus traffic, a lot of car traffic. That bus and car traffic somewhat fades away as you move further away from the school, but the question that I had for the students was, because they're in that environment every day, either coming to school or leaving school, is how does the amount of air pollution in the atmosphere vary as you go further away from the school, but still in an environment where our students are still walking. So I gave my students the essential question, and then their challenge last year was they needed to come up with all the learning activities for the project. Their secondary essential question, which we'll talk about in a little bit, was, all right, if you have this whatever understanding you develop about New York City, how do you apply that understanding to an area where you don't live, which is Southern California? We have a sister school in Los Angeles, and as a matter of fact, we have sister schools. We have 21 schools in 14 countries, so it would be nice to sort of expand this project to all of those schools. So that was their question. How does urban air pollution vary with location in New York City? And then how can you extend that, your understanding and your knowledge to Southern California and Los Angeles? So the students were broken up into teams. I had 15 students in the class. There were some students that were responsible for the constructing of knowledge and understanding. There were some students that were responsible for the data collection, some that were responsible for data analysis. In terms of planning the project from the outset, all the students, once the project was planned, all of the students completed the project. So it wasn't they just planned it and then stopped. They planned it and then executed it. So they started with 2 videos. One was to put it in a historical context, the concept of urban air pollution in New York City. I'm not going to play the videos for you because these are actually static slides. They're not interactive, but if you look on YouTube, you'll be able to find both of these. The one on the right gave a historical context. It was a series of interviews with urban housewives from the 1950s, asking them what they thought about urban air pollution and its impact on their children. Really interesting for the students to see how some of those concerns are still around today. The video on the left, our mayor about 5 years ago came up with something he called Plan NYC, which was to make New York City much more ecologically friendly over the next, by the year 2020. So part of that was looking at ways that we could monitor and reduce urban air pollution. So again, students found these videos. It was great. And then we moved into data collection, and these are the data tools that we use, data collection tools we use this year. One of the really great things, one of the great hidden features of the iPhone and the iPad is that there are starting to become more and more devices that allow for data collection directly on your iPhone or your iPad. So the wind meter, which is the one on the left, costs about $35 US dollars. I can't convert that off the top of my head to Australian dollars. But it plugs, the wind meter plugs right in the headphone jack, and the students can then walk around. What they had them do is they walked to 6 specific locations around the school to measure the wind velocity, wind speed, and wind direction. Okay, got some really great data doing that. The device in the middle is a thermoto, which is a little temperature sensor that plugs into the headphone jack of your iPhone. That cost about $45 US dollars. And these were the only 3 prescriptives that I told the students that they had to use, because I had bought these devices ahead of time, these data collection devices ahead of time. So it would have been a challenge for me if they said, we'd like to buy all this equipment and it costs thousands and thousands of dollars. We did do a little bit of work with a company in France that was developing a air pollution monitor for the iPhone. Unfortunately, it wasn't ready yet, but they have assured us that when it is ready, that they'd be happy to share one with us for testing, and I encourage you to do that. If you're looking for innovative ways to collect data, always asking people for a sample is always a good thing. The last device was a CO2 meter, and I left the chip little 2 off of that. But those I also bought through Amazon. They were also about $200. So I only bought a few of those, but then using this little system, the students could collect wind speed and direction data, temperature data, and carbon dioxide concentration data. And they decided that their research questions were going to be things like, in areas where the wind speed was lower or the wind direction was coming from a certain direction, how did that impact on carbon dioxide concentration? Or if they were measuring temperature, was there a relationship between the local temperature and the carbon dioxide concentration at the specific location? They also had to consider the amount of traffic in that specific location. So that was what the students set up in terms of their previous knowledge. And I see we have a question. No, we don't. Again, if there are questions while we're on.
Question from Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to know, would these devices also work in iPads as well as iPhones?
Yes, they do. So they all fit into the headphone jack of either the iPad or the iPhone. And the Thermoto, by the way, if you're not familiar with Kickstarter, the Thermoto was a Kickstarter campaign, and Kickstarter is a microfinancing website where you can put up projects that you want to have financed, and that's actually where I found it. And I do a lot of looking on Kickstarter for really sort of nifty things that are iPhone and iPad compatible. All right, we'll just wait 1 second. I see some people, I think, writing some questions, but we'll continue. Again, if you do have questions while we're going on, just type in the chat box and we can just stop and answer them. So the other reason why, as a teacher, I like these devices more was because I didn't have to buy a really huge set of data collection devices to use on my computer. They were with my students and their iPads and iPhones. It was very much a localized solution, and it actually turned out to be a much cheaper solution. So let's continue. Let's talk a little bit about what kind of data they collected. So they also had to decide how they wanted to represent their data. Okay? I had some iPads available for the students, and they used an app called Sketch, which I will type in the chat window. They wanted to have a way to plot their own data. The challenge was that making a chart would be sort of interesting, but they decided really quickly a chart didn't tell them enough information. They needed some sort of geospatial representation. So they found the app to use and figured out how to plot their data. And I know the data is sort of hard to see, but they were able to plot in one map wind direction and wind speed. In another map, they were able to plot their air pollution data. I left off the map of the temperature data. But this was really interesting because it gave them a visual way of looking at their own data. So again, students decided how to do this. I just told them you need to come up with a way to represent your data. Their conclusion, by the way, both last year and this year, was that locations near the school that had the lowest wind speed from the northwest had the greatest air pollution, carbon dioxide concentration, which just also happened to be the same location where most of the bus traffic was, so that they learned pretty quickly that there was no way for the air pollution to diffuse away from the bus traffic because when the winds were lighter, it just sort of stayed there and concentrated. The next part of their challenge then was to look at something related to Southern California and to Los Angeles. So that's the only challenge that I gave them. I said, you need to figure out a way to really sort of collect the same data that you collected for New York City. You went outside the school and actually collected the data. You can't go outside Los Angeles and do it. So how could you do that remotely? So one of the things the students found, the students that were in charge of this group, they found an app called US Winds, United States Winds. And the nice thing about this app was it gave current wind speed and wind direction data for Southern California, and it was updated pretty much on an hourly or every other hour basis. So they were actually able to get wind data for Southern California without any difficulty. The next question was, how do you get the air pollution concentration? So using this, they were able to sort of figure out first, like, what was the wind field over Southern California in general. Then they were able to drill down to specific locations and look at changes in the wind direction sort of over time. In terms of getting pollution data, this I thought was going to be their biggest challenge. And they, with a little bit of research and a little bit of investigation in the App Store, they found an app from the Southern California Air Quality Management District, which was free, that gives air quality index values for places all throughout Southern California. The other one, if you're dealing with the United States, and I'm not sure in Australia if this data is available to you, but the United States Environmental Protection Agency also has an app that gives actually even more specific pollutant data in terms of particulate matter and ozone for pretty much every recording station in the United States. So they found that data this year quite by accident. So that became part of their work as well. And I'm not going to play this for you, but their final assessment, I could have given them a test, I could have given them a lab report, but what I decided to do, and the teacher got to pick the assessment, that was the one sort of rule in the planning, was that they had to do a air pollution report for Southern California, and these just came in about 2 weeks ago. But what they learned was, in doing this, they learned some journalism because they had to write it as a news story. They couldn't just do screenshots of here's my data and I'm going to talk about it. But again, they had to include a geospatial representation and then talk about sort of the impact of this air pollution on Southern California. Usually when you ask the students to do this the first time, they sort of freak out because there's many sensors they're used to taking tests. But once they sort of get the hang of doing this, they're pretty good with it. The next project that they're working on in my class is they're going to take the data collection equipment to their own neighborhoods as we're starting to study cyclogenesis. And living in New York City during winter storms, you can have a wide variety of weather all in the same storm. So it could be raining in Brooklyn, which is closer to the coast, but it could be snowing quite heavily to the north and west of the city. So the students in the class this year are going to sort of farm out and collect data, and we're going to tie that into the concept of cyclogenesis and local weather. So they're going to be starting that this week. Again, since all of my students have iPhones this year, which was really quite fortuitous, they're going to sign up the equipment on a weekly basis, collect their data over the weekend, and then the challenge for them this time is that the assessment and however their work is assessed is really up to them. So that they're going to do two things. They're going to determine how best for them to represent their data. Now, some students like doing videos, some students like doing keynotes, some students like doing more formal lab reports. It's going to be up to them. But then the other part of this is that the students are going to actually construct their own rubric for this, so that it's not me telling them what I think is good work. They're going to decide for themselves what good work and good reporting is. So they're really excited about doing this. I'm excited to see what kind of work they do. Should be a lot of fun. So that was my atmospheric science class, and this is where I put on my Katie hat and do my best to explain tracking cicadas. And Katie's essential question, Katie teaches molecular biology and she teaches 9th grade biology. So one of the big events that we have here every 17 years in the United States is the arrival of the cicadas. This is native native to the east coast of the United States. And the challenge with the cicadas is when you have all the cicadas in your neighborhood, they make quite a racket because their mating is by flapping their wings. They flap it at 7,000 hertz, and that's how they attract their mates. Well, you can imagine if you have thousands and thousands and thousands of these cicadas all flapping their wings at the same time, you're going to get quite a lot of noise in your neighborhood. So what Katie decided to do was to look at her students as being citizen scientists, that they're collecting data and then that they're reporting that data. So let's talk a little bit about what she did in order to make that happen. Again, we always go to the students constructing their own knowledge. Katie had the students do their own research about the cicada migration. Those resources were shared among her this was done in her molecular biology class. And she pulled, the students pulled content from Time, from YouTube, from The Guardian, which was interesting that this was being covered in the UK. So that as a class, they built their own understanding about the cicada mating habits. And then here was the interesting part, and just as one of the notes from Katie, is that this was called Swarmageddon. In the United States, we like giving cutesy names to things to make them sound more relatable. So this was called Swarmageddon. So one of the things the students had to do was they had to, at home, measure soil temperatures. And when the soil temperature reaches a certain temperature, that's an indication that the cicadas will be arriving soon. So the students had to build the temperature sensors. Now our class is all girls, our school is all girls. So we always look for opportunities for students to build and construct things, because a lot of times that is not something students get an opportunity to do, especially girls. So this was a joint effort between, we have a digital fabrication lab in our school with a 3D printer, and it was a joint combination between that teacher and Katie, that the fabrication lab teacher came in, showed the girls how to build their own temperature sensors for home. They used a device called the Arduino, which is a really small sort of microcomputer, costs about $35 US. So the students learned how to code for that. They learned how to do breadboarding, which is setting up their circuits. They learned how to interface devices. They learned how to interface the temperature sensor with the Arduino. So we gave them some sort of basic skills in terms of learning how to do coding, but then the students sort of had to figure out for themselves what kind of code they needed to write, what kind of sensor they needed to collect the data that they wanted. So this took about a week in the curriculum, and students walked away with their own little temperature sensors, and they were thrilled. They also learned that they're pretty easy to break as well, as a couple of students did. So once they had their sensors at home, and this happened last March, they were able to collect data from all 5 boroughs. We had students in that class from all 5 boroughs of New York City, and the data was they recorded the data at home, and then they went to the Cicada Tracker website, posted their data. And this was really a great example of crowdsourcing, because the data was part of the larger collection of data of the motion of the cicadas. And you can see in the image that Katie's provided that you can see the motion of the, if you look in the map carefully, the sort of the center part of the map is Washington, D.C., and the cicada track from the lower left to the upper right. So as time went by, the students could see the migration of the cicadas getting closer and closer until they started to report the data that the cicadas were appearing in the New York City area, and then they moved past New York, and then they were able to see it move closer and closer to Boston. So There was also a Twitter that went along with it, hashtag Swarmageddon. So again, once they did their posting of their data, they were able to see, they were able to share that data on Twitter as well. So in terms of their assessment, okay, they had to do a couple of things. First, tweeting the data was really important. Okay. Second of all, each student had to follow the hashtag, the Swarmageddon hashtag. 3, they had to take pictures of them taking the data. Okay. And then 4, there were a lot of class discussions every day as the cicadas made their way from Georgia up to Maine on the East Coast about the data that they were collecting and things like that. So our students became active citizen scientists, but they became active data collectors as well. And if you look carefully in the tweet on the left, you can see that there's the temperature probe, and then on the bottom of that picture is the breadboard, and just above it is the Arduino device. So this took them about 2 days, 3 days to make, but then also they were able to use the camera on their iPhone or their iPad to take pictures of this as well. So the amount of enthusiasm generated by the students was really fantastic. I mean, they were buzzing about this, no pun intended, for the whole time that they were doing this project. And the great thing about it was that they built their own collection devices, they collected their own data, they reported their own data, but then they were part of a larger group that was collecting data as well. And not only that, they got to see that migration right along the East Coast of the United States. The last project I'm going to talk about, as a science teacher, we're always looking for ways for students to collect data. This is a project that was designed by both my students in my advanced placement physics class and designed by me. Our advanced placement program, which is run by the United States College Board, allows the students to earn college credits when they're in high school. So there are certain learning objectives that need to be met in order for students to take the exam at the end of the year. So I had those constraints on me as an advanced placement physics teacher, but I did want sort of the students to have some sort of an input into what they were learning. So again, we go back to what the essential question was, which is, what are the ways that motion is described, measured, and analyzed, both in the horizontal and vertical directions? So all of my course content for my advanced placement physics class is available on iTunes U, and it's a really great repository for a variety of learning tools. So some of our teachers use Moodle, which is great if you're uploading just documents and you want to do a discussion forum, things like that. iTunes U I really like because I can put multi-touch books on there for the students. I can put app downloads on there for the students. Again, in my advanced placement physics class, all of my students have iPads. Now, granted, I only have 8 students in the class, but they're allowed. They have those. They have that tool available to them. So all of their learning information and all of their content is found on iTunes U. So what I asked the students to do was they were responsible for the constructing of knowledge. They were responsible for extending that knowledge using apps. So the students came up with a lot of really interesting learning activities for themselves. A lot of students defaulted to Khan Academy and used a lot of videos there for review. Now, in our honors physics class, they would have learned projectile motion already. So this was sort of extending their knowledge. So they did some review on Khan Academy. And one of the questions that comes up when you do projectile motion is, well, what impact does air resistance have on projectile motion? So one of the students figured out that they could actually write their own code to model air resistance. So the image in the upper right shows a screen capture not very well, but the students were able, actually, she showed all the other students in the class how to write the code in a language called VPython to actually model air resistance. And this was a really great learning activity for the kids and for me as well, because I actually didn't know how to do this. And for me as a teacher, it springboarded me into looking into other ways to using coding in my honors physics class, which I've done this year with a lot of success. So that's how the students constructed their knowledge. They looked at, okay, I can look at an idealized situation where there's no air resistance. That would be my Khan Academy videos. Then I can construct my knowledge of understanding how to model air resistance. I can do that using VPython. The second part of their constructing their knowledge and understanding was, I said to them, I need you to find some apps that would allow you to develop your understanding of projectile motion. But the challenge was, it couldn't be an app directly related to projectile motion. I needed them to figure out a way to take an app and use it in a non-traditional way. So on the left, they used Angry Birds, and I'd love to say this was an original idea from one of them, but she found this on, doing a Google search. And the challenge for them was, and I was okay, I was like, you know what, you did your research, you found an activity, even if it's not self-constructed, it's okay. The students had to figure out if Angry Birds took place on Earth or not. And they did that by creating a video capture on their iPad of Angry Birds. They made some basic assumptions about the measurements within Angry Birds. And then they took their video, imported into Vernier video analysis, which allowed them to do some more in-depth analysis. And from their analysis in that, they were able to figure out the acceleration due to gravity for Angry Birds. And I can tell you, it's not negative 9.8 meters per second squared. Now, they were sort of surprised by that because they just assumed that it took place, but there's a lot more work using Angry Birds as a physics teaching tool, which makes me very excited. The other app that they found was the Tom Daly diving app, which of all things is just getting Tom Daly, the UK diver, to make dives. So they created their own activity where, one, you had to sort of get your best score possible in doing the dive. But then using the time and the information that's included in the app, you can actually calculate Tom's velocity just before he enters the water, if you assume that it takes place on Earth. So again, it was sort of an interesting activity. My students were great. They extended it to conservation of energy as well. So it became, using this really simple app for 99 cents, it became a really interesting interdisciplinary activity for the students that I may not have thought of, but again, it sort of empowered them to say, here's an interesting way to study projectile motion that's sort of in a non-traditional way. And then this was the part that I contributed. Doing more formal lab reports is an important part of the advanced placement curriculum. And so my students used their iPads. They used a data collection tool called the LabQuest 2, which connects wirelessly to the iPad. And then Vernier, which is a US company located in Seattle that makes a lot of data collection devices for science laboratories from like first grade all the way up to 12th grade. They have a device called the projectile launcher. So the students connected the projectile launcher to the LabQuest 2, which was connected wirelessly to the iPad, to collect data about the motion of a projectile. And on the left is a little picture of the lab setup. On the right is some of the data they collect. And if you teach physics, that's a pretty darn good projectile motion curve. So they got some really good data, and this added another layer of complexity to the activity that they were doing. This whole process, in terms of studying projectile motion, took about 2 weeks. The interesting thing about those 2 weeks is I did not lecture at all. It was all them doing self-guided and self-directed learning. So students that took longer on the app, once they finished that, they worked their way to doing their data collection. It was really 2 weeks of like them setting their own standards about what they needed to complete, and then working independently. My role was I was walking around doing facilitating, making sure that they were on task, which they were, and looking at doing a lot of sort of formative assessments as they were going along to make sure that they were reaching the learning objectives that I wanted them to do. And again, we use vernier graphical analysis for our data analysis. For assessment for this, they didn't have a test. Their assessment was their lab report. My students do digital lab reports, so all of their lab reports require a lab photo and a lab video. And I apologize, this is the lab report for their physical pendulum lab. But one of the things that's been really helpful for me as a teacher when I'm doing assessment of their lab work is that having a video and a photo of their lab helps me when they do things, when they're doing their error analysis and they say, I set up my lab this way, and then you look at the picture of their lab and you know that's not how they set it up at all. So it does lead to some really interesting conversations within between teacher and student, but then also my students peer review their lab reports. So students have learned very quickly to say, you said that this is how you set up your lab equipment, but I look at your picture and I notice that this isn't in the right place, and maybe that's one of your sources of error in doing your lab analysis. So again, this was the teacher prescribed part of it, the written lab report and as their assessment. But I figure as a teacher, I get to pick that part. And talking to students afterwards, I would say most of the students like this in terms of a way of learning. There are some students that still are very much, please tell me what I need to do, and I will do those steps. So again, we try and build those learning experiences as well into it. But both Katie and I have noticed that in the last 2 years, as we've moved more towards, and this is true within our whole school, as we've moved more towards a model of students constructing their own knowledge within the parameter of specific learning objectives, they become much more comfortable going down this educational path as opposed to just sitting at a desk and having a teacher lecture all the time. It's been a really interesting journey for both Katie and I and for all the teachers in our school. So we have about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to share presenter information, both Katie and my email and our Twitter handles. If you have any questions or you want any of the materials based on any of these activities, just send us an email. Katie and I are not proprietary, which means if we have it, we will share it with you because, again, I think it models what we want our students to do, which is we want them to be good collaborators and good communicators, and as teachers, we should do that as well. So Ness has a question, so if you'd like to ask a question, go ahead. If there are other questions, you can certainly type them in the chat.
Yeah, my question was just related to, you said that you started, your whole school started doing this sort of thing a few years ago. How long do you, so I was just wondering, if it took you a few years to get to this point, how long do you think it took for the students to be able to understand the process effectively for them to be able to work as independently as they do now?
They have adapted really quite quickly, and which has been great. On the teacher side, on the pedagogy side, there's a lot of planning that goes on in terms, because you can't just say, we're going to read this in the textbook and we're going to answer questions at the end of the chapter. So it's taken the teachers, a little bit of time. The students, and I'll be honest with you, not every teacher in the school is at this point. The first about 2 weeks of the class, like my atmospheric science class, where this in some ways is new to them, we found like our 8th and 9th graders are fine with this because they've actually been doing it a lot longer. But for the seniors, it's sort of new to them. About the first 2 weeks of class, you get a little pushback from them about, well, why don't you just tell us what you want? Because it really gets them aggravated when you say to them, well, I need you to, you're going to figure this out yourself. Once they get over that hurdle, as Katie always says, that's when the magic happens, because then after that, you have them. So once they realize for themselves how important it is that they're actually constructing their own knowledge, it's great. So most of our students now, as they come up, because a lot of our transformations taking place 9th grade and below, a lot of our students sort of come to us expecting this. And so for the ones that haven't expected it, or it's sort of new to them, within about 2 weeks of the class, they're pretty good with it.
Fantastic. I'm really I'm really glad that I got to sit in on this presentation, because it actually got me thinking a lot about how I teach my primary, my grade 3-4 class, and putting a lot more of the learning into their hands, even though I do that to a certain extent. But I think giving them extra chances to come up with a lot more of their own ideas would be so much more fascinating to see what they came up with. So thank you very much, Eric. You've been inspiring. I really, really thoroughly enjoyed this.
Thank you so much for having me.
Once we close out the room, so we know that a lot of people will watch it later, as Sunday mornings aren't the best time for people to want to get up a bit early and have a look at some learning. So thank you very much for presenting to us, Eric, and I look forward to your next session as well, which is a little bit later in the day. So I'll stop the recording.